But my brief today is actually twofold. Firstly, to give you a sort of a brief introduction to the Deaconess Order in Sydney, but also to look particularly at Margaret as the Principal of Deaconess House. And I thought, how do I draw these two together? And then I realised that because of Margaret's initial research interest in the Deaconess movement in Sydney, here was the link. Here was the link. As Peter said, she was a very able scholar. And I'm not going to go through all of the things that she did, but I do want to focus particularly on that Bachelor of Divinity that she received in 1977 with honours from the University of Sydney, because she also received the Rachel McKibben Prize, which was for the candidate in Ecclesiastical History Year 4 honours. So in fact, it was not only was she doing an honours degree, but she was in fact the exceptional student in that honours degree. And her honours thesis was, and I'll read it to you because it's quite long, Deaconesses in the Church of England in the 19th century, with special attention to the early years of Bethany, Church of England Deaconess Institution, Sydney, New South Wales. Now I thought, I have to read it. And I did. It's a fine piece of scholarship. And it helped me immediately to see here was a person who really understood how to research and write history. It only covered the initial part, or the early part of the beginning of the Deaconess Institution in Sydney, but I found it really fascinating because through it you could see Margaret actually coming up with her own commentary and helping us to understand why this happened and what the significance of it was. And so I'm going to utilise some of that as I look at the Deaconess Institution in Sydney. In the last 2 decades of the 19th century in Sydney, there arose the question within the Anglican Church about whether women should be involved in formal Anglican ministry, and if so, what shape this should take. Now in 1885, the Synod appointed a select committee to actually look into this question. And the committee was asked to consider the advisability of organising the religious and charitable work, the interesting way that that was expressed, of women in the diocese. The committee met and they came back with 2 recommendations, 2 motions for the Synod to actually vote on. The first was that this Synod adopts a report of the Select Committee on the Ministry of Women so far as the same relates to the employment of deaconesses in the diocese. So it was, yes, check that one. But secondly, that it's undesirable to establish a sisterhood in the diocese. Now that, it was a clear majority within the Synod expressing that, and that what it indicated was they wanted the deaconesses to be initiated, but because of the evangelical nature of the diocese, they didn't want a sisterhood because it spoke too much of Anglo-Catholicism and its attendant ritualism. And yet while this was viewed positively, that is deaconesses, it wasn't implemented by the diocese. When it did happen a few years later, it was independent of the Synod and thus outside Synod control. And that continued all the way through. Now, the movement to have deaconesses in the diocese is well documented, and you'll find it in a number of books, and certainly this part wasn't particularly hard to research because it really is bound up with Reverend Mervyn Archdill and his wife Martha. Now, he was an Anglican clergyman in Sydney at Balmain. He was married to Martha Carrau, who was the daughter of a Lutheran pastor from Stettin in Germany. And at Stettin in Germany was the Bethanine Deaconess Institute. So his wife was very familiar with basically the German model of deaconesses. And so with the Archdills pushing it, together with a small group of supporters, some significant supporters I might add, like the Reverend J.D. Langley, who was the rector of St Philip's Church here in Sydney, they basically pushed this idea of let's start this up, independent of the Synod anyway. And so as they met, they appointed a lady who was going to become the deaconess superintendent, and her name was Miss Maspero, and she had received her training at the London Deaconess Institute. And so Reverend Archtor was able to inform the Archbishop of Sydney that the deaconesses were being established and had a double link from London and from Stettin. And it seems that Archbishop Saumarez Smith was quite happy with that idea. Now, Margaret says the establishment of the Deaconess Institution in Sydney, yes, it was mostly the creation of Mervyn and Martha Archtor, and she makes this comment, but it did not arise out of any active feminist agitation in the Church of England in Sydney. And women didn't commence the work. She wanted to make that point very clear in her thesis, and she's right. Although first wave feminism was active at the time in the churches around Australia, and this women's movement led to the creation of a number of organisations, usually cross-denominational organisations such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, nevertheless, Margaret once made the point, women weren't involved in setting it up. In fact, for the first 19 years of the Deaconess Institution in Sydney, there wasn't even a woman on the council, even though it was particularly focused on women in ministry. And she went on to make this point, and I thought this was really interesting that she said this, because you could see where she was driving this. Men, who were the creators of the scheme and their supporters in the Church of England at large, held a very conservative view of the place of women in the church and society, and this explains why it was established in this way. And I thought, yes, go Margaret. Don't miss that chance. Now, the other important thing, which I've already touched on, is that the establishment of the Deaconess Institution was outside of the Synod and technically outside the Archbishop's control as well. And although there were generally good relations with the Archbishop during the 100 or so years of the Deaconess Institution, that was not always the case. I won't go any further into that. You might want to ask me the question. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer it, but there you go. But there was no legal governance. It was independent, and that's important to note. So thus established, how did it fare? Well, it began at Balmain, as is well known. It then moved to Redfern, to Lewisham, to Darlington, before finishing at its current site, here in Newtown, at Queen Street, Newtown. And it was really interesting to think about, well, who was going to come in and who was going to be trained? Well, as I read through not only the sources that were available, but some of the other material that I found, women from middle class or well-to-do families were seen as the most likely candidates. However, only a few women applied in the first few years, and that was disappointing. And Deaconess Nichols, who was the head deaconess at the time, suggested that the significant reason was, quote, some women consider it beneath their social position to give themselves to the work of a deaconess. And she went on to assert that this decline in social standing for a woman becoming a deaconess, and she said this, what is the loss of these social distinctions in the world in comparison with serving the King of Kings? And I thought, isn't that a lovely thing to hear? Because the same is also true, to a lesser extent, I think, for men. And in an article in an earlier issue of the Deaconess newsletter, the head deaconess at the time made it clear that she called it the regime for deaconesses in training was usually austere and highly regulated, and she wanted to say explains why it may not have been very attractive to the type of Christian woman the Institute hoped to enrol. And I thought, okay. And again, I could hear Margaret saying, I knew that. And that's why I made changes when I became principal. Now, the number of deaconesses trained in Sydney over the years was never large. Between 1901 and 1913, only 15 women became deaconesses. Nora Tress, in her book, Court for Life, a story of the Anglican Deaconess Order in Australia, which I found an interesting read, states that there were 132 women trained as deaconesses in Australia from 1891 to 1991. Now, of that number, the greater majority were trained in Sydney, a lesser number in Melbourne, and very few elsewhere in terms of numbers. And of course, the last deaconess was set apart in Sydney in 1991. Now, the first two deaconesses trained at Bethany were set apart at St Andrew's Cathedral in September 1893. And the service for the making of deaconesses made it clear what the ministry would be like for them. And I'm reading from the service. To aid in all spiritual ministrations, except public services of the church, to assist in all such good works as shall be committed unto her, to nurse the sick, to visit and relieve the poor and afflicted, to tend and instruct the young and ignorant, to minister especially to women who need to be brought to the grace and service of God, and in all things to help the minister of Christ in any parish in which he may be appointed to serve. And to a large extent, the ministry of deaconesses followed that form for the rest of the time. Over the years, the Institute established schools, nursing homes, hospitals in which deaconesses could minister. And as well, the ministry of Deaconess House broadened to include women undertaking theological studies, but not intending to be deaconesses. And of course, to take in female university boarders. And by the 1960s, many women entering Deaconess House to study often married before they were set apart or married soon after, and therefore did not work as deaconesses. Well, that's my brief. I'm not going to get any more on the Deaconess Institute because I don't have that much time. But before turning to consider Margaret's role as principal, I really need to give a bit of context by talking about her predecessor, because it was a sea change when she took up the role. When Mary Andrews retired as Principal of Deaconess House in 1975, that was a really important point in the order in the Deaconess Institute. For she is something of a legendary, and I thank Peter for the next word, formidable figure in terms of not only the Deaconess Institute, but the diocese at large. Now, Mary had been both head deaconess of the Deaconess Institute as well as Principal of Deaconess House. And she'd held these positions since 1952, so right through to 1975 in terms of being principal. One of her students described Deaconess Andrews as a loving but firm director. And you can take your own connotation from the word firm. Although she had abundant energy, holding both roles meant that she was heavily involved not only in the training of women to be deaconesses, but in the administration operation of many aspects of the Deaconess institution. When I looked at the things that she did just within the Deaconess institution, I'm surprised she lasted as long as she did. She was on the boards of the Deaconess Institution, the Home of Peace Hospitals, the Braeside Church of England Hospital, the Lisgar House Management Committee, the Hillside Management Committee, and the Deaconess House Management Committee. And it doesn't include her diocesan commitments and her other involvements. Now, when Margaret Rodgers replaced Mary Andrews as principal in 1976, Mary Andrews still remained head deaconess of the Deaconess Institute. And I thought that was interesting. You may have, a better thing. This, I think, is a picture taken at the time that she became head deaconess, principal of Deaconess House. So do you recognise that, Peter?
I do now.
You do now. But what happened? So what happened? Why was this important? Well, why was it important was it meant that Margaret was able to focus particularly on Deaconess House in a way that Mary could not, given all the other responsibilities she had within the Deaconess Institute. And in fact, from that point on, the roles were split. So that when Mary retired as head deaconess in 1982, Jean Stanfield became head deaconess. And that was important. And I think it freed Margaret up. So what qualifications and experience did Margaret bring to make her suitable to be the principal? Well, she had been made deaconess, as Peter said, in 1970. She had been a tutor and assistant to the Principal of Deaconess House from 1969 to 1973. And as Peter mentioned, she had been warden of the Church of England Women's Hall in 1974 and 75. So she was not only familiar with the operation of Deaconess House, but in her role as ward of the Women's Hall, it meant that she had some executive and leadership experience in both places. And in both places, she'd exercised a pastoral role. And her obvious academic ability that Peter has mentioned and touched on before, meant that she was well placed to lead Deaconess House in encouraging women to undertake rigorous ministry training. And I think rigorous really sums up the way that she thought about the training that women should undertake. She was really keen for women to be well trained in gospel ministry. In a report of her first year as principal, and I should note that I went through and looked at all the principal's reports of the Deaconess Institute to sort of see what she focused on in those reports. She was able to note an increase in the number of Deaconess House students. There were 19 students enrolled in her first year, with 11 women enrolled in first year itself. There was also a full complement of boarders. By 1980, Margaret was reporting that the first year group was the largest in many years. The total number of students enrolled was 29, so it had grown. In 1983, there was again significant growth, and many of those enrolled in either Bachelor of Theology or the Diploma of Bible Ministry, both courses run by Moore College. Yet it was more than about numbers of students. She wanted to see women undertake more rigorous theological and pastoral study. And the Rev Jarrett, her successor as principal, said that Margaret in her time as principal challenged many women to tackle, and she used the word tackle, the Bachelor of Theology degree. They also noted that she encouraged this by her own scholarly example, that she was a scholar. She was intellectually able, as Peter has already mentioned. Now, she made it clear that she wanted to introduce change at Deaconess House. I was talking with, online with Jacinth Miles and asked about her recollection of Margaret. And she said a conversation she had with Margaret when she was a tutor struck her at the time. And she said, I'll give it to you. Whether you use it is up to you. Well, I am using it. And it was this. She said, Margaret, why are you becoming a deaconess? And she said, Jacinth, you can only change an institution if you're in the institution. And there was indication, so she was coming in and she was going to make some changes. Peter's already mentioned about the uniforms, and I'll take that back. This is an older photo, but you get the idea. It wasn't quite like that at Margaret's time, but it was a time of uniforms, and the uniform for men was the academic gown. But that's not just the only thing. Meal times became less formal, food choices more attractive. She was open for pastoral reasons to deaconess candidates living away from Deaconess House if there were good reasons to do so. And as principal, as Peter's mentioned, she was a member of the Moore College faculty, a capable teacher delivering lectures in church history. And again, Darrell said that she won the respect of her Moore College peers and students for her teaching ability, her capacity to analyse, and her ability in discussion. And Peter's already picked that up. New initiatives were undertaken while she was principal. New courses of study were offered to the women at Deaconess House. For example, she introduced a course on mission studies. She felt that had not been sufficiently done. Regular in-service seminars were organised for women working as deaconesses or parish sisters. Ex-student reunions were established, and this resulted in the ex-student students' fellowship. I think that's right. She was also keen for people to know something of the calibre of the women training at Deaconess House. And as I looked at her principal's report, she often highlighted some of the students who were there training in Deaconess House at the time. Now, I'm just touching on this briefly, others will pick it up later, but while she was principal, she wasn't just confined to Deaconess House. She took the opportunity to be involved in international and national conferences and consultations. And as I read through this, I thought, whoa, these are just some of them. She is a very busy woman. The Australian Anglican Deaconess Conference, the Anglican Delegate of the Australian Council of Churches, member of the Partners in Mission Consultation, the Anglican Church of Australia, delegate to the World Council of Churches, Conference on World Mission and Evangelism, the Lausanne Consultation, and so on. And of course, she began to have a media presence. Right, I'm not going to try and steal your thunder, but one thing that really interested me was she was involved in the Interfaith Service Turning Towards Peace in 1982, which was broadcast on the ABC. And she was there, and the other people who were mentioned are the Dalai Lama, Bishop Bede Heather, Catherine Dawson of Parramatta, and Rabbi Brian Fox, the Chief Minister of Temple Emmanuel. She was basically there amongst her intellectual and spiritual peers at that thing. As principal, she was involved in diocesan discussions about the role of women in ministry. Now, Peter's already touched on this. She was a member of the Archbishop's Committee to study the theology of ordination, and she said that she hoped the report will, quote, be received as a significant contribution to the life and ministry of the diocese. She wanted to make this very clear, that this was not just a report to be received, it needed to be acted upon. And her successor, again, Narelle, said that Margaret represented the work of women in the diocese well and had done much to encourage the progress towards the opening of the order of deacons to women, and of course she wanted more. Now, much of what I've said has been taken from what sources there are available. Let me tell you, finding sources on this was not easy. I had to really dive down into what I could find. But it doesn't tell me what she was like as a principal. And thanks to the efforts of Jacinth and Janice for their work, they kindly contacted some of the women who were at Deaconess House in Margaret's time, or who knew her, and I was able to hear from these women about Margaret and what she was like. And here are some excerpts. Now, I'm going to use their names. I think that's okay, because there's nothing particularly controversial, I think. But if you think I have overstepped the mark, then let me know. This is from Daphne May. She said, I have vivid memories of the vast improvement in food served when Margaret became principal. And Christine is nodding her head vigorously on that one. Also, her encouragement for the women students to preach in the Deaconess House chapel, and the careful, helpful feedback she then gave each student. I get the feeling that she was not a gentle critique of the sermons, but she did it in a way which was helpful, but at the same time didn't gloss over what she saw as any weaknesses. From Diane Jeffrey, she remembers Margaret as an excellent tutor, and when principal, as a woman of great strength of principle and Christian faith in practice. She said Margaret was very kind and understanding to Diane when Diane was ill and required frequent respite. So there's the compassionate, thoughtful, caring person. Marcia Green recalls Margaret's keen mind and academic rigour as a tutor, as well as being a patient friend. And that when Margaret was the principal, she offered Marcia a part-time job at Deaconess House to supplement the very meagre income that she and her husband had, because her husband was a PhD candidate. And that she basically encouraged, and I think probably organised, Christine Hill to mind Marcia Green's children on her behalf. Marcia also remembers that Margaret was always smartly attired, and the picture we saw at the beginning reminds us of that, and well organised, with all her materials ready and accessible for diocesan meetings. And I think she had to be well organised because she was probably, if not the only, but one of the few women who would be there. She felt she had to be ready, well prepared. Helen Plummer remembers Margaret as a great encourager for Helen to keep going in her studies and then to look forward to the Christian service beyond. Karen Watt, who was Karen Lovell at the time, who I know, says no, she has not only found fond memories of Margaret, but regarded her as one of the wise women of that generation. Her experience was that Margaret encouraged her to take up a position at the Macquarie University School of Christian Studies as a tutor. And this meant Karen would have to leave Deaconess House as a resident, even though she was still a Moore College student. And although there were strict rules about females living in, Margaret saw the advantage for Karen to do this and was prepared to adjust the rules when needed. Now, Janice, if you're happy for me to speak about what you said, then I will read this. Janice said Margaret was a fascinating character, one not easily defined nor pigeonholed. She had a wry sense of humour, was meticulous about schedules and self-discipline, was loyal to her rugby league team, and we're not sure which team that was, but whatever it was, she was very loyal to it, and loved classical poetry. She tutored Janice over the first year summer break when you had to resit your Greek exam. Is that right? And she quietly despaired when you didn't do the work she'd set. Yet she treated you as an adult and didn't harangue you, but you got the message and you passed with good marks. And she was pleased. That is, Margaret was pleased. And Janice goes on to say she was generous with her time and the resources she had to offer, And she remembers Margaret inviting her to accompany her to meet a delegation from the Three Church Movement of China. A rather bizarre event, but Margaret was poised and confident and certainly not unaware of what was going to take place. And she also knew the realities of her situation within the diocese and particularly Moore College. She was astute, fair, but no fool. She knew what she was up against, and nevertheless she was prepared to keep going into it. And I thought it was interesting to read those to you because it gives us a glimpse of the person rather than just the institutional material that I could find, and it helped me to better understand her. In February 1985, Margaret resigned as Principal of Deaconess House. She'd held the position for just over 9 years, and Narelle Jarrett penned a fitting tribute. She spoke of the depth of Margaret's contribution to the ministry of Deaconess House, to Moore College and to the Anglican Diocese of Sydney, stating that she was a godly example to those in ministry training. She was respected for her untiring work and service, and people particularly noted her clear-headedness regarding theological issues. Now, apart from the assessment of Margaret Rodgers, that assessment by Narelle, and that's the picture of Margaret that I best remember, there doesn't seem to be any other detailed appraisal than I could find. And I was really interested that when I read Nora Tress's book about deaconesses in Australia, which was published in 1993, the focus is primarily on deaconesses in Sydney and provided some brief biographies of the significant deaconesses, and Margaret wasn't included. And I sort of couldn't work out why this was the case, but reading through the biographies, I concluded that perhaps the reason why is that she never matched the norm of a typical deaconess. She hadn't been formally involved with a nursing home or hospital or children's home, and although a keen parishioner in her local church, she had never been a parish sister. Indeed, the path she chose after resigning as Principal of Deaconess House in 1985 was not typical, as Peter mentioned, but it was a position well suited to her abilities and interests, but not one that matched the expected pathways for a deaconess. And perhaps that's the reason that Nora didn't include her. I don't know. But I sort of got that feeling that she didn't sort of match the other biographical profiles in that book. So what to say about her in terms of her as a principal? Well, as I read through the material, both the oral and source material that I could find, she was obviously very able, intellectually bright, someone who's looking to make changes where these were appropriate, flexible when needed, a great encourager, without doubt, always setting high expectations for students, whether that be academic or other, yet patient and kind. And above all, as principal, she was committed to serve the Lord Jesus by utilising the gifts he had given her in ministering to the women under her care, so that they could be as well equipped as possible for the work of ministry that they would be undertaking. Rod, I'm open to questions.